How do we know if a population is healthy? When we talk about a population, remember we're dealing with a group of similar organisms. So, one of the ways that we can know is the size of the population, but we also need to look at the density of the population. That is, we might have a very large population, but in a very small area. Right? That's the density of the population, how many are in a small area. We also need to consider the distribution of that population. In other words, if we're looking at the population in a county, but all of the living things are in one bottom left corner, that's the distribution of that population. Another thing we need to consider is the structure of the population. That is the age and sex ratios. In other words, is every organism in that population young? Is it old? Is it pretty evenly distributed? Are they mostly male? Are they mostly female? Or is it 50-50? We also need to consider the growth rate. That is the birth plus immigration, those moving in. We need to subtract those in the population that are dying or immigrating, that is exiting. And then we need to look at the population growth patterns. That is it exponential growth? Has it reached its carrying capacity? And what density dependent and independent factors might influence this population? Let's take a look at some of these things about a population and whether or not it's healthy. So, the size of the population is how many of those organisms are in an area. And then is that too dense? In other words, are there too many of those organisms in that area? And then how are they distributed? So here are some examples of how populations are distributed. In the example of A, that's called a uniform distribution. All of those dots represent an organism in that population, and you'll notice that they're spaced out pretty uniformly throughout that area. In B, all those dots represent organisms in that population, and you'll notice that it's random. There's no real pattern in where they're located. In the example of C, those dots represent organisms in that population and they're clumped together. So they're not evenly spread out through that area. They're only found in two small pockets in that area. What about the distribution, like the age and sex ratios? So the first blocks that you're seeing there represent birth. Now, if living things were born and then none of them died, our population pyramid might look something like this. All of those living things advance to the next age class, and new members of that population are born, but they don't die. So the older ones advance to the third age class, and new ones are born, and then the fourth age class. So if there were no death, we would have a population structure that looks something like this. All of the organisms that were born continue to go into childhood and then become teenagers and then become adults. And the ratio between boys and girls would be, or males and females would be 50-50. So that would be in a perfect scenario, no death. But that's not typically how things work on Earth. So take a look at the top graph where we have the birth rate, and it's pretty even between males and females. However, some of them are going to die. So the next age class is going to be slightly smaller. As those organisms age, there's new ones that are born, but some of the older ones are going to die off. Maybe they get eaten by a carnivore, maybe they succumb to a disease, but whatever happens, the population gradually gets smaller as they get older, as they approach the end of their life cycle. So, depending on the shape of these population graphs, we can analyze the health of that population. Is it 50-50 males, females? Are there a whole lot of older organisms, but the birth is really low? Are there a whole lot that are born, but not many are making it to the upper age classes? We could analyze the health of the population based on those diagrams. This is called a survivorship curve. And what you're looking at are three different types of individuals and how they survive. You'll notice that generally humans are born and most of them survive to become adults, and a lot of them survive to be elderly, but at some point there's going to be some die off. So a lot of adults might not make it to be elderly, and a lot of elderly might not make it to, let's say, 100 years old. You'll notice that the type 2, we have a high number of births, but then we have a lot that are lost in childhood. So in this case, um, the young hawks might not survive to become adults. In the type 3, we have a tree that produces hundreds of thousands or millions of acorns even. There's acorns everywhere. But a lot of those acorns are lost. Very few of them become saplings, and then even fewer become adult oak trees. So these are different types of organisms with different strategies to survive. So humans, for example, have relatively few offspring, whereas a oak tree is going to produce tons and tons and tons and tons of acorns in hopes that maybe one will become a sapling that might grow up to be a mature oak tree. We can also measure the population health based on its growth. So here's our population of squirrels. Going into that population of squirrels are the birth rate and the immigration rate. That is, how many new squirrels are born each year and how many squirrels have moved into that location from a different location. That's going to increase the population. However, the population is also decreasing by death and immigration. So the squirrels that get run over on the road, or they die of old age, or that leave because of competition or other reasons, they might leave. That's going to decrease the population. So we can make a calculation of how much is that population growing or shrinking from year to year based on the number of birth and immigration subtracted from the number of deaths and immigration. So let's say that we have an organism that arrives in a new location, a new habitat, and it begins to reproduce, and that population begins to grow. So there's plenty of food, there's plenty of space, there's plenty of resources, and that population begins to grow. Lots of birth, maybe some immigration going into that population, and that population begins to skyrocket. Well, at some point, the there's going to be some competition for resources. At some point, the resources are going to start to run out. So maybe it's space, maybe it's food, whatever those resources might be, they start to run out, and the population starts to level off. So as that population is growing up, that's called exponential growth. The population might be doubling or tripling every year. That's exponential growth. But at some time, that population will start to level off and become more logistic growth. That is a more realistic kind of growth curve. Whenever it reaches its peak, like this is the highest amount that that habitat can support, that that ecosystem can support, then that's called the carrying capacity. That is, anything over the carrying capacity, there's too much competition for resources. Anything under the carrying capacity, there's plenty of resources available and the population can grow into it. But once it reaches that line, that's the maximum number of organisms that that population can, that ecosystem can sustain. That's sometimes called the K carrying capacity, K carrying capacity. There are some factors that can influence population size. Some of these are called density dependent factors. Some are called density independent factors. That is, when there's a high population in a very small area, there's lots of competition. There's going to be an increase in predation. That is, the apex predators are going to notice that there's a lot of easy food in that area. Those are density dependent factors. It becomes easy for disease to spread from one organism to another, or for parasites to thrive because there's such an abundant population, and it's easy for those parasites to be able to take advantage of organisms in that population. There are also density independent factors. In other words, it doesn't matter how many organisms in your population are in an area if there's a natural disaster. Like whether there's 1 or 500, it didn't matter. That tornado went through that area and destroyed a lot of them. Or maybe a storm, a hurricane, or maybe a drought. That doesn't really matter how many squirrels there are. The drought is going to have an adverse effect on that population. That's population um, in density independent factor. All those things are related to population health, whether it's the size or the distribution or density, whether it's the carrying capacity or density dependent and independent factors. All those things are indicators of a healthy population.